Hi, Charlie. Thanks so much for speaking with us today.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So this is Dr. Charlie Swensen, a renowned and brilliant DBT writer, philosopher, teacher, therapist, thinker. His latest book is DBT Principles in Action, Acceptance, Change, and Dialectics. I highly recommend it. He also has a podcast called To Hell and Back, which is, I think, how many episodes are you up to now? Like 100?
Well, I'm in the 80s. I've done about 81 hour podcasts, but I haven't done any for a few months because all of my creative spare time is getting taken up helping one of my children with his college homework, literally, many hours per week. So I really know a lot more about business than I used to.
Is that working for you? Is that helping you?
You know, it's taking a long time to make the connections to make it really deeply meaningful to me, but every once in a while it is.
Well, that's quite a DBT. I mean, to be able to find the moments that actually resonate for you when you're in the depths of something that's kind of overwhelming and boring. I mean, that's a pretty mindful thing to do there, Charlie.
No, it is. It has a lot of the same thing. I mean, you do have to make assessments and do analysis and figure out, you know, your goals and your functions and your costs and your revenues and all of this kind of stuff. So actually, it's not uninteresting at all. It's just that it isn't what I would rather be doing with my own creative time. But I'll get back to that. I'll be doing more podcasts.
I've enjoyed it. It's wonderful. I recommend everyone sort of have a listen. It's a phenomenal podcast. Whether you're already invested in DBT or not, it's a really, really interesting way of understanding life, lived experience, the world, challenges. And we'll talk more about that later. But Charlie, you had a very kind of, I don't want to say unusual, but an interesting trajectory in your life. You really went from being convinced you were going to be a physician, I believe, and you did become a physician and then a psychiatrist, and were for many years committed to a very psychodynamic, so I would imagine psychoanalytic way of understanding therapy and interaction with patients. And then at some point, really pivoted and began to embrace DBT. And before we kind of dive a little bit into what and how DBT, how you understand it, perhaps you could just let us know a little bit about what your path looked like. This is very inspiring. And don't forget the basketball part.
Well, you know, actually, it goes back before that. The basketball part's important because I grew up in a small town in Oregon with a bunch of brothers, a lot of sports, a lot of television, not many books, and
Really?
and I really thought that I would become I really deeply wanted to be an NBA basketball player, and I played year round, all the time. I knew every gym in town. I knew everybody who played basketball. I loved the game. And I just thought I would do that until I discovered by the time I was a late teenager that I didn't have enough talent to get to that level. And once I saw the writing on the wall about that, I thought, oh shit, now what am I going to do with my life? I've already lost my main vision of my life. And I just started being a good student and playing some golf and doing other things I was capable of doing without being incredibly athletic. And then I went off to college and I studied, I became entranced with biology, with the cell membrane, especially the physiology and structure of a cell membrane and how it makes it possible for us to live.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, and I thought I would go down that road. I thought I would become a researcher about cell membranes and biology, and then I bailed out of college because I was no longer. It was during the Vietnam era, and I found myself caught, like a lot of people were at the time in the early 70s, and about what to do with my life, given the how devastating it was that what was going on in Vietnam and other things. And I left college and I just roamed. I traveled. I took a couple of jobs. I spent about a year hiking, taking jobs, living different places, beginning to play some music. And then I went back to school and finished up. And I had decided I'd become a doctor because I liked biology a lot. And I also liked working with people, and I thought I might do community organizing through healthcare. So that's where I was at that point. And then I did apply, and I finished college, went to medical school, And during medical school, I entertained all kinds of careers. You know, you get a lot of chances to try on different careers when you're in medical school. And I was everything from a pediatric neurosurgeon to a pathologist to a family physician. And by the end, I decided to be a psychiatrist because I just found it fascinating, like how to apply understandings of the brain and literature and meaning, and how does all this fit together with people. And so I was very happy to do psychiatry. I got psychiatry training. And it so happens that where I got all of my psychiatry training and my medical school training, which was at Yale, it was really a psychoanalytic place. It was a medical and psychoanalytic place, and I became a medical and psychoanalytic psychiatrist. I was in psychoanalytic training for years. I did psychodynamic treatment. I did my own psychoanalysis, etc. And I was very immersed in psychoanalysis and thought it really was the key to everything. But you know, I have to say, Nina, in retrospect, when I look at the trajectory you're talking about, the seeds were already there to change something, because I found being a psychoanalytic psychotherapist for my personal style, from my small town upbringing in Oregon, and from my hopes of being a basketball player or a basketball coach, it was too restrained for me. I had to sit still for long periods of time. I had to remain very objective and follow the rules for long periods of time. I had to be really careful and patient about my interventions. And I really had to hold back a fair amount of the part of me that wants to be a teacher, wants to be a coach, wants to be a player in the world. And so it worked. I mean, I found my way of doing it, and I found my way of working, moving on to New York and working with Dr. Otto Kernberg about doing psychoanalytic psychotherapy with people with borderline disorders. And I enjoyed that a lot, but it was also a strain for me. I don't know that I could have said that at the time, because I was working so hard to understand it and make it work. But when I learned of DBT in the middle of my work with borderline patients at the hospital in White Plains, New York, DBT came into being in the late 80s, middle to late 80s. And I read something, I heard something, and I went out to Seattle and I visited Marsha Linehan, who at that point was the only person doing DBT in the world. It was only in her lab. She was still developing it. And so I got in kind of early and got to see her and talk to her. And I just found it fascinating that somebody from a completely behavioral framework, somebody who's really into action and changing the world through skills, through cognitions, through behaviors, a very different frame of reference than psychoanalysis, which has really looked changing the world through interpretation and meaning and insight. And so I really liked it. I thought it was a great thing to add into our treatment in New York. And I came back and nobody but me wanted to do it that way. So I was given the opportunity to develop a different program within the same hospital. And I learned DBT little by little and developed a program and worked a lot with Marsha Linehan. So then we had two programs at the hospital, but I increasingly spent my time in the DBT program. And what linked the two, so it isn't like I really jumped from one ship entirely to another, from my point of view, though some people might see it that way. They're integrally connected to each other in that they both revolve around transforming lives through storytelling. They're both related to finding a narrative and then trying to change that narrative. I mean, I'm reducing it down to its simplest elements, but I really came to think of it that way, is that psychoanalytic work, you're really listening carefully for the sort of hidden narrative, the shadowy narrative behind the narrative. And then you're trying to help somebody see that, understand that, and start to realize what narratives they are actually playing out in the relationship and in their lives, and give them opportunities to rethink whether that's the narrative they want to play out or whether they want to change their narrative. And when I got into DBT, at first I didn't see it that way. It was so heavily protocol-based and behavioral that I didn't realize at first that what you're doing exactly in DBT, but with a different format and a different structure, is you are eliciting a narrative from the patient, like what is their story of how they ended up doing such and such a behavior. And then you're looking for opportunities within that story to tell a different story or to create a detour and end up somewhere else that may be more closer to your values or closer to your goals or closer to a healthy life. So it was just the structure of what's called a behavioral chain analysis in DBT, which is a horizontal structure, was just a different way of helping somebody arrive at a narrative, which then allows you to start to make sense of it and make changes in it. But it's done very differently. It's done more behaviorally. It's more hands-on. It's closer to the family physician or the coach or the player that I wanted to be, and the teacher. But it's still based around trying to understand a narrative and change a narrative. And so, I came to feel over the years that, yeah, I had made a big detour from my original plan with psychoanalysis. But the detour was driven not by any understanding of what was better for the world. It was more what fit better for me. Like, what could I do with who I was and really fulfill myself in the treatment I was doing? I felt like I was doing a treatment that wasn't quite the right match for me. And as brilliant as some of it was, and as interesting to study, I was more comfortable in the realm of action. So that I'm, rather than having somebody come in, and I had a man come in once into therapy one day, and he came in and stood in the waiting room, and I had a cup of coffee with me because it was typical for me to start my day with a cup of coffee. And he knew that, but he stood there in the waiting room with his coffee, and he looked at me and he said, "Would it be all right if I brought my coffee in there?" And I thought, of course, my natural friendly response was, "Of course you can. You may have noticed I have coffee in here." But then on the way into the room, I thought that was an interesting thing to ask me. That's an interesting story behind that. What is going on? And this is a man who was talking to me about bigger issues in his life, about not being very assertive in his work, and therefore that was holding him back. He wanted to be a higher level person in his organization than he was, but he knew he was kind of like deferred to other people and submitted to things. So I thought as I walked in, oh my God, it's happening. This is it. He's being submissive. He's deferring to me, even though it's obvious, of course he can bring coffee in here. So when we sat down, rather than psychoanalyze it, rather than ask him if he noticed that he did it and ask him what the meaning of that was, I just said, it was a little strange that you asked me if you could bring coffee in here, because you know that I bring coffee in here. And what kind of person would I be if I said, no, you can't? So, and I'm not that kind of person. So it was kind of, don't you agree? It's kind of a weird thing that you asked. And he said, yeah, I guess so. I said, you know what? And this is where I went from one model to another. I said, let's go back in the waiting room and let me come into the waiting room and invite you to the session. And you have your cup of coffee. I want you to handle it differently. Think about what you want to do. So we went back and we did that. He was a little taken off guard, and he came and then I came and said, hey, it's time for session. How are you? And you could tell he hesitated for a moment, wanting to say, is it okay if I bring the coffee in? But then he just said, yeah, I'm ready to go. And he came in, and then I said, so how was that? And without going any further about that, to me, that's an essential difference of a psychoanalytic approach, which would more interpret, understand, find the meaning of it, layer it against previous life history, layer it against what's going on in the transference and all these things, versus just say, this is a problematic behavior. This is a strange behavior, especially given that you're trying to change submissive behavior at work. So let's just fucking do it. Sorry for the language, but let's just change the behavior now and see how that feels. So it's kind of like action precedes insight. So basically that was the trajectory. And I've found more and more ways to be in the DBT and CBT, the behavioral world, which I find closer to an affinity to my personality. And at the same time to stick with what I find so valuable about psychoanalytic work, which is really trying to change stories in people's lives.
Well, I have to say, thank you for all of that. It's so refreshing and remarkably affirming to hear the way you describe your passage from, or your growth, really, because what you're describing is an organic process of an affirmation of who you really are, and a way to engage with the world in a way that makes sense for you. But also, what I really appreciate is that you are very invested in not seeing these different modalities as silos, which are irreconcilable. And there are many people who do either explicitly or implicitly feel there's nothing, you cannot reconcile behavioral and psychodynamic interventions. And I profoundly disagree with that. And which is why as a student, I was drawn to you as a teacher for many other reasons as well. But there's something about the way that you, when you describe that particular interaction you just described, that vignette you just described, you literally had your patient enact, like literally enact, somatically enact a moment of noticing, of awareness. You didn't just describe or talk about it, which you could have done, but you also, so to me, you also as a clinician have a way, and I think this may derive in part from your experience as an athlete, I really do. You have a very, I suspect, a very nuanced relationship to your own body, both as a musician and as an athlete. So you're aware of the way that your body does things, which express potentially things that you're not even aware you're feeling. And so it seems to me like you're interested in bringing ideas about bringing your experience of the body into the way you engage with your patients or your clients. And that's really fascinating.
I think that's an interesting way to put it. I'm not sure I've thought of it exactly that way, but I do think when you do either a psychodynamic approach or a behavioral approach in a very studious way, organize there's a rational framework to either of these approaches, to all of these approaches, and so you can just sort of stick with the rational framework and have what's called a case conceptualization based on your model of treatment, whether it's a behavioral model or a psychodynamic model. It helps to have a case conceptualization. It helps to have a GPS if you're trying to get somewhere. So you've got a case conceptualization, which is sort of like your GPS, and it's made up of a lot of rational ingredients. But what I found over time is that I would create these case conceptualizations, and they would be rational frameworks, and I wrote about them, and I taught about them, and talked about them, and heard other people talk about them. But what I then noticed over time is that if I just let myself interact spontaneously with my patients, I would start doing things that didn't necessarily fit in that rational framework. Like I'd have a rational framework on how to intervene. I remember with a 17-year-old girl who kept getting herself drunk, and she would actually pass out, and she would be on pavement, and she would be nearly dead, and her friends would take her home to their house so nobody would get caught, and time after time. And I remember I had a framework of understanding her, and I was doing a behavioral approach with her. And then one day, she was talking about this, and that she had done it again and done it again. And I knew something about her parents, and they had been relatively decent people, and she knew that. She didn't think they were terrible. And I said, let me just ask you something. Are your parents decent people? Yes. Yeah, they've always been decent people. Did you used to have an idea of what you were going to do with your life, like growing up in that family? Yeah, I wanted to be a fashion photographer when I was 12 years old, and I went to a camp, and I wanted to end up in Paris doing that. I said, okay, so now you're sneaking out at night from home, you're not telling your parents where you are, and you're getting drunk to the point of unconsciousness and near death. What the fuck are you doing? What the fuck are you doing with your life and with your family's life? How do you understand this? And so the way I interacted was not just a planned intervention. I got really upset with her the way you would if you were somebody's father and they were doing this. Dear, what are you doing? And so when I did that, it did a couple of things, but the part I want to focus on right now is what you brought up, because what it did was, by just being there with her spontaneously and having a spontaneous response to her, rather than one that was framed through some sort of interpretation or meaning, I saw what I did. I noticed what I did. I thought, oh, this is not in my case conceptualization. What is this? And I would call that by now an implicit case conceptualization. It comes out through your body. It comes out through your spontaneous interactions, your tone of voice. So you have to become authentic in therapy and let yourself truly be there, because then you might do things that you didn't even know you thought, which actually might be good for the patient or might not, but you can evaluate that once you do it. But a lot of psychotherapy models stifle being actually that authentic, to get up and tell somebody, no, let's go back to the waiting room. And this is,
Right.
not sure anybody had ever done that.
Earlier, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about music, and you described your your improvisational, your interest in improvisation, both as a guitarist and a pianist. Charlie won't tell you this, but he's quite an accomplished musician, a guitar player, guitarist, pianist.
You're right. I wouldn't say that.
You're accomplished. You're an amateur, but you're very good. So, and I say this as an amateur musician myself. So, I'm struck by the fact that you're so interested in the improvisational. You were talking about jazz piano, that you're now really interested in jazz piano, and jazz piano is fundamentally, it requires extraordinary skill and a kind of really a profound familiarity with the rudiments, as you say, the case conceptualization equivalent of piano. I got it all down. I know all my shit. I can do it all with my eyes closed. And now I'm going to forget everything and improvise. And that's the place that you're describing. I think if you get to that place, if you can arrive at that place as a clinician, where everything you've accumulated through life, through professional experience, informs choices which surprise you. And that's the thing about DBT. You also talked about dialectic. You talked about both improvisation and the fact that the relationship you would like to establish with your clients, with your patients, is fundamentally dialectical, which itself is predicated on equity. And that's the difference. DBT, I think one of the most revolutionary things about it, which we don't really talk about, is that it is very equitable, that it doesn't privilege the therapist in the same way. I don't think that was necessarily Marshall Linehan's intention at all, but it just is the way it's enacted. It's like there is an expectation that though the therapist is providing the opportunity to the client or the patient to explore and change, there's not a presumption of authority. And relinquishing that authoritative voice is unbelievably challenging for many, many, many people. So you have been able to relinquish that voice of authority. And I think that is a part of the DBT, which we don't really discuss, but that's interesting to me.
Well, I think that it's that has, when I first started to learn DBT, I thought, well, I'll probably spend a year learning this protocol-based model of treating with people with self-harm behaviors. And I thought it was a much smaller box that I was entering, and that I would get it and then I would move on. But actually within that box, because there is a whole concept of a dialectical philosophy of relationships and of change, and there's also a whole philosophy and practice of mindfulness and Zen and Buddhism. You put those two ingredients along with behaviorism, you have a very powerful sort of three-pronged, three-paradigm approach to anything in life. And so that includes music, so that the dialectical part is, as you put it, like, you know, your chord progressions, you know, the melody, you know, some things that go together, you know, based on theory. And then when you start playing, of course, if you're thinking about those things very much, it doesn't come across as very improvised. It comes across as sort of canned. And psychotherapy can come across as kind of canned. And so, but when you let go of momentarily or temporarily of that framework, of those protocols, of that conceptualization, whatever it is, of the theory, you know, that's when you do things that you've never done before. And those are the greatest moments. Those are the greatest moments in performance in general. You know, you were in a training of mine. I can't remember if I shared this story, but I love this interview with Michael Jordan about, somebody asked him once in an interview after he was done playing basketball, what was the best thing ever about playing basketball? It really captured this. He said, you know, it was those moments when it's a playoff game and there's like 20 seconds left and the score is tied and we're taking the ball out and everybody in the arena knows I'm getting it. Everybody on the other team knows I'm getting the ball. Every one of the millions watching on television know that I'm getting the ball. The whole world knows I'm getting the ball. And so the whole goal of the other team is to stop me. And my goal is to score. And I have no idea how I'm going to get there. Maybe I have one idea, but once I get going in those 20 seconds, I have no idea. And I start twisting and turning and moving this way and moving that way and doing things that I know how to do. But he said the best moments ever in playing basketball are when I realize I'm doing something that I've never done before. And he said, those are the moments that I lived for. And I just thought, you know, this is not actually, if you follow sports very much, this is not your most articulate athlete in the world.
Yeah.
With his body, he's the most articulate athlete in the world. And I used to watch him at Madison Square Garden on a regular basis. And so I just thought that was brilliant. That was really like DBT or psychoanalysis or anything. It's those moments that you have the freedom within a framework to do something you've never done before and learn from it and figure it out. I mean, that's great stuff. I mean, that's the mixture of performance and creativity and change-oriented psychotherapy. So
isn't
yeah,
that interesting? The way you describe it is interesting, because what he talked about, Michael Jordan, he didn't, as you're telling, and you're such a wonderful storyteller, and sort of wrapped up, you're hearing, the millions are watching, everyone in the stands is watching, the other team is expecting, everyone knows I'm getting the ball. But he didn't say the great moment for me is when I hit the 3-pointer, or when I sink that. It was not the moment of success. It was the moment before success. It was the second before, when I sense I'm about to do something I've never done, a new thing. And it wasn't about the outcome, even though he could be pretty fucking sure he's going to sink that ball, right? If anyone's going to do it, it's going to be, but it's almost like, and that's the hardest thing for driven people, not that I know any, driven people to sort of acknowledge that if you can truly, that is literally engaging with the process as opposed to the outcome. And I think like, that's so profound for a person who's probably better at the outcome at that time than anyone in the world. And potentially, arguably, I know there are LeBron people, there's other people, GOAT people. Well, who's the GOAT? It is arguable he's the best. He's certainly one of the top 3, right? So it didn't matter. Like it was about it was the most deeply embedded process-oriented moment. And I think what you're describing when you talk about literature before, you said, I think about bringing literature and an idea of a storytelling. And I was thinking about storytelling. When you construct a novel or a narrative, you have the plot, which is the movement, the action, the moving forward. And then you have the reflection. You have all the character building and the analysis and the stuff that goes into creating people who you care enough about to give a shit where they go next. So it's like the plotting, the narrative, the movement, the choices, the angles, the streets, the roads taken and not taken. That's the DBT part in a very dumbed down way. Yeah. And the backwards looking, the thinking, who is this person? Why? What? That's the psychodynamic stuff. The two can't, if you read a book that's all about the plot, it's boring. Some people like plot-driven narratives. I don't particularly. Some people love that kind of storytelling. It's quick. Some people can sort of languish in sort of the regurgitative, sort of like backward looking sort of, but most of us thrive on both. So it seems to me that you're interested in integrating a kind of a way of reflection and action, that those are the two polarities of the things you're integrating. But so to me, that's extremely, it's almost like a revolutionary way of understanding this. And my hope is that as we continue to lean into modalities like DBT or RODBT, which I'd hope to be able to talk to you about, that psychodynamic psychotherapy allows for that, what you describe as a permeable membrane. And I want to get to your metaphor, because you, in one of his beautiful, beautiful blog posts that you wrote a couple of years ago, you describe how, as a student working in a laboratory, a biology lab, I believe it was 1969. It was like in the smack dab in the middle of the worst of the Vietnam War, when people were just saturated with misery and horror. And you sort of sequestered yourself in what I believe was like a basement type space. And you worked on slicing, and you were doing a very complicated and deliberate, fascinating experiment in which you were basically taking apart the hearts of, was it frogs' hearts?
Of embryos.
Yeah. And you were chopping them up. You were chopping up the hearts, and you were splicing them into smaller and smaller and smaller bits, trying to arrive at the exact point at which those independent microcosms, those chopped up halves and quarters and eighths and sixteenths and 30-seconds of this heart would stop beating. And what you found over and over again was, quote, "When I severed connections to the rest of the body, still the beats continued. The hearts had lives of their own." And I'm curious about that, because to me, that was a gorgeous, gorgeous metaphor. The heart insists on its own existence. It can be battered and bruised and wounded, and sometimes even sort of chopped away at. But there's a there is a point at which it stops working. There's a broken point where there's no going back. But you seem to be suggesting that irrespective of whatever else happens, there's an urge. We talk about urges a lot in DBT. There's an urge to persist. There's an urge to go on. There's an urge to live. And I would say also more theoretically, there's an urge to love. And so the capacity for love, it may, as hard as you work to diminish it, it insists on itself. And I saw that as a beautiful kind of way of understanding something about DBT and about therapy. And I thought that was just a gorgeous moment that you described.
Well, I think, I mean, I think you, I love the way that you take it, including talking about love. To me, it was to notice that even after cutting an entire heart, after disconnecting it from the body and then cutting it into pieces, and the pieces are all still beating independently of everything else. They like have their own life that keeps going and keeps going. If you have it in a tissue culture where it has its nutritional needs met, the electrical activity keeps going, and then you chop it into smaller bits and smaller bits and smaller bits, and the tiny bits keep going. It's sort of like a whole world of independent hearts, all of which came from the same heart. And they keep beating. And I was just curious how it could do that, once you've disconnected it from the usual rhythmic, excitatory pathways in the heart. You know, it has its own pathway. It has its own capacity to live, has its own capacity to still beat and beat in synchrony with its fellow cells. And then the idea, the research further was to then, at the moment that you get down to the smallest cluster you can of cells, before it's going to die, before it's going to stop, like freeze it. And then when you freeze it, put it in the electron microscope, and then take a look at what's going on in the cells and between the membranes. So I just thought it was an amazing, it was just, I think what it is that relates to psychotherapy is just, you know, an interest in finding out something that never occurred to you before, or that something that just seems so mysterious. I mean, you work with patients, you know, I was just working with somebody earlier today, a 15-year-old girl, and she does things that just baffle me. And I find it so fascinating. So I just say, it's sort of like the frog heart cells. It's sort of like I say, let's take a look at this. Wow, I can't believe that you're thinking of going back to school and saying that to your old crush, you know, that you have such painful feelings about, that you're going to go back and say that to her. That's so amazing. What an interesting thing that you're going to do that. Where's that coming from? And so that's a little bit like, that's any type of psychotherapy, but it's just curiosity. It's curiosity. And it's also noticing the relentlessness of life. You know, that even cut all of in little bits, your life keeps persisting until you really don't give it any chance of surviving, you know. So it's, I thought that. So I appreciate that you brought that up. I don't think anyone has ever commented on that blog to me. I wrote it and just put it out there, but I appreciate that you noticed it and that it grabbed something in you.
I'm so surprised no one, I mean, to me, that I've read many of your posts and much of what you've written, but there is something so fundamental about that, about the beauty of that, the idea that, and again, I get back to the idea that not only does the body insist upon itself, but the spirit does too. Like I'm here. And I think what is inspiring about DBT is its insistence on locating the smallest bit. As long as it's still beating, as long as there's a beat going on there, we can grow. You know, I just think there's something about that.
That's true.
But you also in the same post you talked about, you described this earlier when we were speaking, which is why I'm bringing it up, about the membrane, that people sort of presume there's this sort of explicit and sort of a membrane that sort of creates a boundary between the inside and the outside of the cell. And you described that, in fact, the concept that there is a boundary around the cell turns out to be an illusion. There is a semi-permeable membrane that allows things to move in and out. And to me, again, this becomes a metaphor for the dialectical relationships between dependence and interdependence that you also described. So we have to balance, and this to me is again what DBT addresses. And what you talked about when you talked about your client earlier, who was standing out there with a cup of coffee, because dependency and independence and interdependence are so deeply connected with ideas of power and control and mastery. And so you chose in that moment to engage with the idea of dependence versus independence, and in a way that was physical and literal, but also intellectual and spiritual. And so to me, that is also a function, a really fundamental DBT philosophical point, that you try to sort of notice when you can be self-sufficient and effectively self-sufficient, and when it is necessary and even beneficial to reach out. And I think those are very hard. It's a very hard dynamic to sort of figure out for oneself, you know?
And I think that what I find interesting about what you're saying, and this thing that, including the little scenario about Michael Jordan, et cetera, is that DBT has this interesting dialectical framework in that it is, if anything, it's an outcomes-oriented treatment. The only validity of the treatment is if you get good outcomes. So you're always focused on getting good outcomes, but actually, in my experience, if you're focused on the outcomes while you're doing it, you don't do it very well. You have to actually have a non-out. You have to be ready for something to happen and do something that you have no idea whether it's going to further your cause or whether it's going to get you in trouble. You have to be ready to do unusual things and try something and try a behavior and try an exercise, try a role play, try something between you and your client that you hadn't thought of really before it came to your mind. And I've just, it's sort of part of my, again, pardon the language, but my what the fuck strategy in psychotherapy. The what the fuck strategy is, if you think about doing it and you're on the fence, rather than debate about it, just do it. I mean, and then recover from it afterwards. But it's sort of like, because it's going to be more authentic, which has more power to it. And it's also may help you discover something that doesn't fit in your framework and it doesn't fit in your understanding, but our understandings are so limited of how human beings function that of course it doesn't fit if you just go with something. So Michael Jordan was interested in the outcome. He wanted to win the game, but actually what made him so brilliant was the fact that when he played, he was more interested, like you said, in the process. And I think that that's a good metaphor for psychotherapy. And yet it's really hard to sometimes live with the bifurcation of outcome and process.
It's interesting because I wonder, one thing that I think, this is sort of pivoting a little here, but one misconception I think that many people have about DBT, or one thing people might be curious about, is because it was originally sort of formulated to address presentations which had been resistant to basically sort of to almost any intervention, like borderline personality disorder, which was so sort of unilaterally resistant, treatment resistant, and sort of bound to all kinds of, despite many, many attempts to intervene, and suicidality. So it was sort of structured for these disorders of under control, disorders that were very that had some relationship to borderline disorders or suicidality, but that it's since then been understood to be much more expansive and much more applicable to other kinds of disordered or disordered thinking or challenging presentations. And if you were addressing this question, how does DBT address more sort of, I want to call it, for lack of a better word, existential crises like depression, essentially, or a kind of overwhelming anxiety disorder, or a kind of general sense of dysthymia, these kind of presentations that have no behavioral necessary. I'm curious about how you would explain DBT's relationship to those kinds of challenges.
Well, first, I think that DBT really is a kind of a complex treatment for a complex disorder. So if you have some things that are better understood without having that complex framework, like let's say you have ways of understanding depression or anxiety, and there have been decades of work done on how to deal with depression and anxiety that are behaviorally or psychodynamically oriented, I would lean there. First, I wouldn't lean to DBT. DBT is really like a sledgehammer compared to a sort of a intricate instrument, and yet it's filled with intricate instruments. I mean, that's the nature of the sledgehammer, is it's made up of all of these other instruments. So it's interesting that way. But so I wouldn't necessarily think that I would apply DBT to all of the things you just said. However, the core of DBT, the core target or the core goal of DBT is to address those aspects of human behavior that are driven by emotions that are not very well regulated. So that covers a lot of territory. I have somebody came in a few weeks ago, and she just wanted to talk about the fact that she felt there's no point to living. There's no point in life. She's not hurting herself. She's not directly suicidal. She doesn't have an eating disorder. She doesn't have a substance use disorder, all these standard things that you can apply DBT to because these are driven by emotional dysregulation. But she has a different kind of emotional dysregulation. It's emotional dysregulation that leads her to think there's no point to living. Like, why am I living? And so it's a little bit harder to do a simple application of DBT to that. But if you're thoughtful about it, yeah, you can start to discover in sequences of her behavior and her internal story, where does it go awry? Where does it go to the point where there's no, or maybe this is somebody who is actually a brilliant person and is an existential philosopher in the making, and she's actually discovering something very important about life, that there actually isn't any point. We always have to make up points. So there's always that possibility. But you can use a lot of concepts from DBT and interventions from DBT, even with things that aren't natural targets of DBT. There are the natural, obvious targets of DBT: suicide, self-harm, substance use, addictions, eating disorder behaviors, dissociation, post-traumatic stress disorder. All these things are like on the table. Of course, we use DBT with all of these, but you can use DBT with other things too. That's part of what my podcast is made up of. It's sort of like to hell and back. Mm-hmm. It's like you can use DBT concepts and principles when you're in hell, and there's all kinds of versions of hell. So that's what I try to explore in the podcast, is like, and you've heard some of them, so you know what I mean.
Do you think that it's necessary to go to hell, in whatever that means for you, for us, for people? Do you think that suffering, this is really a DBT Zen mindfulness kind of question. Do you think that suffering is essential to happiness or to fulfillment? Do you think that one needs to experience loss or pain or emptiness in order to know fulfillment and joy and creativity?
I'm not sure I'm the expert on this question, but I'll tell you my take on it. I do. And I think I draw it more from Zen and Buddhism and mindfulness thinking than from the rest of DBT. I do think that, and it's dialectical in that I think happiness, you only truly appreciate happiness when it's built out of the fact that you also know suffering. And so I think it's really hard. You can be cheerful and smiley and have a good life, and people can do that without depths of suffering. But I think there's a sort of quality of, I think that Thich Nhat Hanh, as a Buddhist teacher, talks elegantly about how, in order to have flowers, you need to have garbage. The garbage creates compost, and compost creates fertile soil for flowers, and then you see something as beautiful as a flower come out of it. But you can't have the flower without the garbage and the compost. And I think it's the same idea with human suffering, is that it comes out of that if you can work your way through human suffering and loneliness and emptiness and sadness and grief, and go through those things and then realize, guess what, I'm alive. You have a different kind of appreciation of what it means to be alive. You kind of think, wow, I'm alive. What else do I need? I'm alive. I'm seeing things, I'm doing things, I'm with relationships, I'm going to try something new. All of this stuff really sits hand in hand with the negative experiences of adversity that people go through. So I think you can have happiness of various forms without having to go through depths of suffering. But I think on the other hand, there's certain kinds of joy and meaning and happiness that come from people who've been through adversity. And the fact is that if everybody pays close attention, everybody's had adversity. Mm-hmm. Like I teach groups of DBT skills, and I never have someone in my group who doesn't have adversity or hasn't been through adversity. And some of them have better lives than others on the surface. But actually, you get down to it, everybody's been to hell. And so it isn't like my podcast is just for those 20% of people who've been to hell and back. It's like,
No.
we've all been there. We just sometimes don't think of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of us feel as though we have to, that suffering implies physical excruciating pain or some extraordinary loss, which it can. But suffering is also you can suffer drip by drip by drip, like wearing away a stone. And I think that the fact that Marshall Minahan's ultimate goal was to create for people lives worth living. I thought about, what does it mean to have a life that's worth living, that has value to you? And that kind of assessment requires a kind of exploration, which is fundamentally painful. And I think it's necessary. But having said all that, I want to mention that one thing that you have shared with your students and with the world, in addition to your work as a writer, is music. And you are known for these brilliant sort of lyrical takes on well-known songs that you use to sort of imbue your students and your community and your co-workers with DBT concepts in humorous, but also kind of very kind of compelling ways. And there's one song that you shared with us. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous song that you said, I think you shared it with your children when they were growing up as a nighttime song. It was a song, I believe, that was taught to you at a Buddhist retreat. I think I may be misremembering, but you shared it with us, and I was wondering if we could close. It's a beautiful song, and when you shared it with the group that you were teaching, when I was a part of that group, we were all sort of very deeply moved by it. It was sweet and gentle, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind. I know you don't have your guitar with you, and I wish you did, but if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask about a different song, so now I think I know what you're talking about.
It doesn't matter. Whatever you want to sing is fine.
I have to go into what's called my DBT songbook. So let me look at that in my files right now.
Yeah.
And yeah, the one I think you're talking about, I learned at a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, and it was called Breathing In, Breathing Out.
That's right.
You think that was the one you're talking
about? It was definitely breathing in, because I remember it was breathing in, breathing out.
Okay, so we can do that one. Let me just get it up, and I know you can see me, but I can't see you because I'm looking at the screen to make sure I get. But actually, now that I think of it, now that it's this song, I actually know this song because, like you say, I sang this to my children many times. It's literally like a lullaby, and so I'll try to get into performance mode of it because.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
It's not a problem.
It's such a beautiful song, and it's just.
It is a beautiful song, and it has some hand gestures that go with it. So right. I got to free up my
body. It's the body, and it's like everything sort of working together. So it's great.
Yes, it's about breathing in and breathing out. So it goes like this: breathing in, breathing out, breathing in. Breathing out. I am, oh gosh. I am blooming as a flower. I am fresh as the dew. I am solid as a mountain. I am firm as the earth. I am free. Breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. I am water, reflecting what is real and what is true. And I feel there is space deep inside of me. I am free, I am free, I am free. Yeah, I love that song when I first heard it, and it's if people know Thich Nhat Hanh's work, you've probably heard that song either on a tape or you've been to a retreat, but it's a lovely song, and it did help people go to sleep in my household. It's calming.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's very beautiful. It's very beautiful.
You're
And
welcome.
thank you for talking with us today. It's been
Very
a
interesting.
thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.
See you
So
soon.
I look forward to talking to you again.
You too. Thank
All
you.
right.